The scent of garlic and butter filled the kitchen, mixing with the rich, earthy aroma of simmering tomato sauce. Emma stood by the counter, chopping fresh basil, while James stirred the sauce with an exaggerated air of concentration. "You're taking this very seriously," Emma teased, watching him swirl the wooden spoon like a master chef. James smirked but didn't take his eyes off the pot. "This is high art, Emma. You don't just stir sauce, you coax out the flavors, seduce them into perfection." Emma rolled her eyes. "Seduce them? Absolutely. Cooking is about passion," he said, lifting the spoon and blowing gently before offering it to her. "Tell me that's not the best sauce you've ever tasted." She leaned in, lips parting as she took the taste. The warmth of the sauce spread across her tongue, rich and tangy with just the right hint of sweetness. "Damn it," she admitted. "It's really good." James grinned triumphantly. "See? Seduction." She laughed, shaking her head as she sprinkled the basil into the pan. Moments like this had always been theirs, light, easy, filled with teasing and effortless intimacy. As James reached for the Parmesan, Emma hesitated for just a second before blurting out, "I have a surprise for you." James, mid-grate, looked up with interest. "Oh?" Emma wiped her hands on a dish towel, heart hammering, and stepped toward him. She pulled a small white stick from her pocket and held it out between them. 2 tiny pink lines. James froze. The cheese fell from his fingers onto the counter, forgotten. For a second, he just stared, his expression unreadable. Emma's breath caught. Then his face broke into something raw, something utterly unguarded. His hands found her waist, pulling her into him, and he pressed his forehead to hers, his breath shaky. "We're having a baby?" His voice was barely a whisper. Emma nodded, emotion catching in her throat. A laugh, disbelieving, joyful, escaped James's lips. He lifted her off the ground, spinning her once before setting her down, cupping her face between his hands. "I love you," he murmured, kissing her deeply. "I love you so much." Emma melted into him, warmth spreading through her chest. In that moment, everything was perfect. Emma woke to the sound of rain tapping softly against the bedroom window. She rolled over, reaching for James, expecting the comforting warmth of his body beside her. Empty. She blinked, groggy, and ran a hand across the cool sheets. He wasn't there. A glance at the clock, 2:13 a.m. Frowning, she pushed back the covers and sat up, her body still adjusting to the quiet changes of pregnancy, slight nausea in the mornings, an unfamiliar heaviness in her limbs. She listened for movement. The house was silent except for the steady patter of rain. James was working a lot lately, late nights at the office, early mornings before she even woke up. He had always been dedicated to his job, but something about it felt different now. Sliding out of bed, she padded barefoot down the hallway. A faint glow spilled from the crack under his office door. She hesitated before pushing it open. James was at his desk, his laptop screen casting a pale blue light over his face. He didn't notice her at first. His eyes were locked on the screen, shoulders tense. "James?" He flinched. His hand moved fast, too fast, closing the laptop with a quiet but decisive snap. Emma's stomach twisted. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Just couldn't sleep." Her eyes flicked to the laptop. "Work stuff?" "Yeah." A pause. He wasn't looking at her. "James," she said softly, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" He forced a smile. "Of course." But she could see it now, something shifting beneath the surface. A restlessness, a quiet unraveling. "You should get some sleep," he said, standing and pressing a kiss to her forehead before brushing past her, heading back to bed. Emma stayed in the office a moment longer, staring at the closed laptop. Something was changing, and for the first time she felt it, the faintest whisper of unease curling in the back of her mind. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Emma poured herself a cup of tea. She cradled the warm mug between her hands, her mind still lingering on the night before. James sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, his coffee untouched. He looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes, jaw tight like he hadn't slept at all. "You're quiet this morning," she said casually, watching him. He didn't look up. "Just tired." Emma took a slow sip, studying him over the rim of her mug. She had always been able to read James, his moods, his thoughts, the subtle shifts in his expression. But lately, he felt like a stranger. Her gaze drifted to his phone. He was texting someone. His fingers moved quickly, and then, just as she opened her mouth to ask, he turned the screen face down. Something sharp twisted in her gut. She set her mug down. James. Is something going on? His head snapped up. What? You've been distant. You barely talk to me anymore. You're always working late. I told you, it's just work, he cut in. Too fast, too dismissive. Emma inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Then why won't you talk to me about it? Why do I feel like I'm going through this pregnancy alone? James rubbed his temples. Emma, please. I don't want to fight. I don't either, she shot back. I just want to know what's wrong. For a moment he looked like he might say something. His mouth opened, then shut again. Nothing is wrong, he said finally. You just have to trust me. Trust. The word sat heavy between them. Emma swallowed, nodding slowly. But as James stood, grabbed his keys and mumbled something about needing to get to work, she felt it settle deeper. Something was wrong, and trust wasn't enough. She needed answers. Emma sat at the kitchen table, absently tracing circles on the rim of her mug as she watched James. He stood by the sink, rinsing his plate, his shoulders tight with tension. She had been watching him more closely these days. Every small change, every missed conversation, every excuse. You're home late again, she said, keeping her voice even. James dried his hands on a dish towel. Yeah, work's been. He paused, as if searching for the right word. Busy. Busy. The same word he had used every night this week. Emma exhaled. You didn't text me back. James glanced at her, confused. When? This afternoon. I asked if you wanted me to pick up dinner. Oh, sorry, I didn't see it. You read it. He went still for half a second before tossing the dish towel onto the counter. I was in the middle of something. Emma studied him. What's going on with you, James? Nothing. You're never here. When you are, you're distracted. You barely talk to me anymore. James rubbed his temple. Emma, I don't. And now I find a charge for a therapist on our bank statement? James's head snapped up. His expression shifted, subtle, but undeniable. You went through the bank statements? They come to my email too, she said. You've been seeing a therapist? James opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned away, bracing his hands against the counter. I don't want to talk about this. Emma stared at his back, her pulse picking up. You don't want to talk about anything lately. James let out a slow breath. Can we drop it? Emma's stomach twisted, but she nodded. For now. Emma lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to James's steady breathing beside her. His body was close, but he felt miles away. Her mind wouldn't stop. James was in therapy. He had been for a while, and he hadn't told her. Why? She turned onto her side, watching his silhouette in the dim light filtering through the curtains. He looked peaceful, but she knew better now. She thought about the way he had reacted earlier, the stiffness in his posture, the way his expression had shut down completely when she brought up the therapist. It wasn't just work stress. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper, something he was actively keeping from her. Her eyes drifted to his phone on the nightstand. The thought was intrusive, unwanted, but they're all the same. If he wasn't talking to her, who was he talking to? Carefully, she sat up, inching toward his side of the bed. Her fingers hovered just above the phone. One tap, one swipe, and she could see if there was someone else. Her hand curled into a fist. She couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, she exhaled and lay back down, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Tomorrow, she would try again. She would ask, push harder if she had to. Because whatever this was, whatever was pulling him away from her, she needed to know. She had to. The doubt gnawed at Emma all morning. She tried to focus on work, flipping through manuscripts, marking edits, but the words blurred together. By afternoon, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. James had told her to trust him. But how could she trust someone who refused to let her in? That evening, she waited until he left the house. He had been vague again, just running errands. But Emma didn't believe him. So she followed him. She kept her distance, staying a few cars behind as he drove across town. He wasn't heading to his office. He wasn't meeting friends. He wasn't going anywhere that made sense. Then he pulled into a small parking lot beside an unfamiliar office building. Emma slowed, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. James stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, his shoulders tense, his head slightly bowed. He looked like a man walking toward something he didn't want to face. Emma's stomach knotted. She parked a little further down the street, waiting until he disappeared inside. Then she stepped out and walked toward the building. The sign near the entrance made her stop cold. Dr. Alan Pierce, clinical psychologist. Emma's breath hitched. James wasn't running errands. He wasn't at work. He was in therapy. And whatever he was dealing with, whatever was tearing him apart, he had decided to handle it alone. Emma sat on the couch, fingers laced tightly together, her heartbeat steady but hard. She had gotten home before James, giving herself time to process what she had seen. When the front door finally opened, she kept her voice even. "Where were you?" James hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Running errands." A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "That's not true." James shut the door, exhaling. "Emma, I followed you," she cut in. "I saw where you went." Silence. James's face drained of color. He stepped forward, then stopped, as if unsure whether to come closer or stay where he was. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low. Emma ignored the flash of guilt that pricked at her. "Then you should have told me the truth." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration tightening his features. "Emma, are you cheating on me?" His entire body stiffened, his head snapped up, eyes wide. "What? No." Emma held his gaze. "Then what the hell is going on, James? Why are you lying to me? Why have you been acting like some stranger I don't even recognize?" James swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. His hands curled into fists at his sides. But when he finally spoke, it wasn't with anger, it was with fear. "It's not what you think," he said quietly, "but I can't tell you. Not yet." Emma's stomach twisted. "Why not?" "Because I don't know how," he admitted. His voice sounded small, almost broken. "Please, Emma, just trust me." She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But trust required honesty, and James was still keeping secrets. Emma sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The confrontation with James had left her shaken, but it hadn't given her the one thing she needed: answers. He wasn't cheating. She believed that now. But that didn't make his secrecy any easier to accept. If he couldn't tell her the truth, she would find it herself. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her recent searches. Dr. Alan Pierce. The address was easy enough to find. She had seen it with her own eyes. Her fingers hovered over the number listed on his website. A part of her hesitated. This was wrong. It was invasive. Then she thought of James, standing in their living room, looking at her with fear in his eyes, still refusing to let her in. She hit dial. The phone rang twice before a woman answered. "Dr. Pierce's office, how can I help you?" Emma swallowed. "Hi, this is Emma Carter. I'm calling on behalf of James Carter. I just need to confirm some scheduling details." A pause. Then, "Of course, let me just pull up his file." Emma held her breath as the receptionist clicked through the computer. "Here we go. Mr. Carter has been seeing Dr. Pierce twice a week for several months now." Emma's stomach lurched. Twice a week. For months. Her voice came out weaker than she intended. "Oh, right, thank you." She hung up before she could hear anything else. The phone slipped from her fingers, landing in her lap. James had been in therapy for months. And he had never once told her. Emma stared out at the street, her pulse roaring in her ears. Whatever was going on with James, it wasn't new, and that terrified her more than anything. Emma moved through the day with a quiet, suffocating weight pressing on her chest. James had been in therapy for months. He had been hiding something for months, and now, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't look at him the same way. She stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing out her coffee mug, watching James across the room. He was at the table, flipping through a work folder, but she could tell he wasn't really seeing the pages. His eyes were vacant, unfocused. She wondered if he could feel it, the shift between them, the way something had cracked, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked. James glanced up, startled, as if she had yanked him from another world. "Yeah, fine." It was a lie. She had heard him tossing and turning, had seen him staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night, lost in thoughts he refused to share. She forced a smile. "Good." James's gaze lingered on her for a second longer than usual, like he was searching for something. Then, just as quickly, he looked away. The distance between them had never felt so vast. Later that night, Emma lay in bed beside him, her back turned, listening to his breathing. Slow, shallow, restless. She reached out, pressing her fingers lightly against his arm. A silent plea. James didn't move. Emma stayed like that for a long time, her hand resting against him, waiting for some sign that he was still with her. But James was slipping away, and she was running out of time to stop it. The house was silent when James left the next morning. Emma stood at the window. It wasn't the first time she had stood in this room and felt like she didn't belong. James kept it neat, almost too neat, no clutter, no personal touches beyond his architectural sketches pinned above the desk. His laptop sat closed, locked, but Emma wasn't looking for something digital. She wanted something older, something he couldn't erase with a keystroke. She started with the drawers. The first two held nothing but pens, old receipts, and work documents. The third was locked. Emma swallowed hard. She shouldn't be doing this. She knew that. And yet, her hands moved on their own. She knelt, pulled the bottom drawer with more force than necessary, until it suddenly gave way, sliding open with a jolt. Inside, tucked between worn notebooks and loose sketches, she found a small, battered leather journal. Emma hesitated, then carefully pulled it out. The edges were frayed, the cover stained with time. She ran her fingers over it, then flipped it open. Inside were sketches, dozens of them, buildings, floor plans, rough designs scrawled in pencil. Some were familiar, things James had worked on for clients. Others looked unfinished, frantic, the lines dark and pressed so hard into the paper that they nearly tore through. And then she saw it. A folded slip of paper, wedged between the pages. Emma unfolded it slowly, her pulse thudding. It was an address. She read it once, then again. It wasn't one she recognized. She pulled out her phone and typed it in. A location popped up. A cabin, miles outside the city. Her skin prickled. Why did James have an address to some remote cabin scribbled on a piece of paper? And why did something about it make her feel like she had just stepped over the edge of something she couldn't undo? Emma sat at the kitchen table, staring at the address on her phone. The cabin was deep in the woods, isolated. There were no listed owners, no obvious connection to James. But something in her gut told her it was important. She needed to know. That evening, as James sat across from her at dinner, she casually asked, "Where did you grow up?" James didn't look up from his plate. "Here, mostly." "Mostly?" His jaw tightened. "We moved around a lot." Emma studied him. "Did you ever live outside the city?" A pause, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Why are you asking?" "I don't know," she lied. "I was just thinking about our kid, about where we'd want to raise them. Somewhere quieter, maybe." James pushed his food around his plate with his fork. "I don't like the woods." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. She pressed gently. "Did you ever live in the woods?" James's fingers gripped his fork a little too tightly. Then, without looking at her, he said, "I don't want to talk about it." Emma's heart pounded. She had touched something James had spent years burying. And the fact that he wouldn't even say the words told her one thing: she was right to be afraid. That night, Emma woke to the sound of heavy breathing. She turned over and saw James sitting at the edge of the bed, his back to her, his shoulders tense. His hands were clasped together, his knuckles white. "James?" she whispered. He didn't answer. She sat up, touching his arm gently. "Hey, what's wrong?" His breath came unsteadily. It took him a long moment before he finally spoke. "I never wanted you to see that place." Emma's blood ran cold. She gripped the blanket, steadying herself. "What place?" James's jaw clenched. He shook his head, as if already regretting saying anything. But Emma couldn't let it go. "I found the address," she admitted. "It was in your office. I know it's important." James exhaled sharply, running his hands over his face. "You don't understand. Then make me understand." Silence stretched between them. Emma could see the battle happening behind his eyes. Then finally he looked at her. "That's where I grew up," he said. His voice was quiet, flat. "That's the house I was born in." Emma's heart pounded. "James." "I left it behind for a reason," he murmured, "and I never wanted to go back." James left the house early the next morning without a word. Emma sat at the kitchen table, staring at the address on her phone, her thoughts circling the same question over and over. What had happened in that house? And why was James so afraid of her knowing? By the time he returned that evening, his face was pale, exhausted, like he had spent the whole day fighting a war in his own mind. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at her. Then quietly he said, "If you want to know the truth, you have to come with me." Emma felt her breath catch. James swallowed, his voice rough. "Tomorrow, we'll go together." Emma held his gaze. Then she nodded. They were going to the cabin. The morning air was thick with an uneasy stillness as Emma packed her bag. She folded a sweater carefully, her fingers moving on autopilot, her mind elsewhere. Across the room, James zipped up his duffel with stiff, precise movements, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding hers. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say, not until they got there. Emma slung her bag over her shoulder and followed James out the door. The sky was gray, the air heavy with the promise of rain. As she slid into the passenger seat of the car, she stole a glance at James. His hands gripped the steering wheel before he even turned on the ignition, his knuckles white. She wanted to reach for him, to tell him they didn't have to do this. But something in the set of his shoulders told her otherwise. They pulled onto the highway in silence. The miles stretched long between them. Emma tried to focus on the hum of the tires against the road, the rhythmic flick of the windshield wipers as a light drizzle began to fall. But her eyes kept drifting to James, his tense profile, the way his throat bobbed when he swallowed, how his fingers flexed and tightened around the wheel like he was bracing for something inevitable. She thought of the cabin, of the fear in his eyes when he spoke about it. "How long has it been since you were there?" she finally asked. James's grip on the wheel twitched. "Since I was 15. Emma's stomach tightened. "That long?" He nodded once. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been circling her mind since last night. "Why now?" A muscle in his jaw tensed. "Because I can't keep running from it." Emma let his words settle between them. The further they drove, the more the landscape changed. The city faded behind them, replaced by stretches of empty road, dense trees lining either side like silent sentinels. The deeper they went, the more Emma felt a strange creeping unease settle over her. Everything out here felt untouched, forgotten. The trees loomed taller, the road stretched longer, the air itself felt thicker. And James, he barely blinked, his focus locked straight ahead, his silence heavier than ever. Eventually, he slowed the car and turned onto a dirt road, barely visible through the overgrowth. Emma swallowed. "Where are we?" James exhaled sharply, like he was shaking something off. "We walk from here," he said. Emma stepped out of the car, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled like wet pine and decaying leaves, thick with the scent of the forest. James grabbed his duffel bag from the trunk and adjusted the strap over his shoulder, but he didn't move right away. He stood there, staring down the barely visible path that cut through the trees, his face unreadable. Emma followed his gaze. The dirt trail was narrow, almost overgrown, winding its way into the dense woods like a path leading to something long forgotten. "How far?" she asked. James didn't answer at first. Then quietly, "A mile, maybe a little more." Emma nodded, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool breeze. James started walking, and she followed, their footsteps crunching against the damp ground. The further they went, the more suffocating the trees became. The branches overhead twisted together, forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The wind barely reached them here. The only sounds were their footsteps, and the occasional rustling of unseen animals in the underbrush. James walked ahead, his shoulders tense, his pace steady but hesitant, like he was forcing himself forward with each step. Emma swallowed. "Did you come this way when you left?" James nodded once. "Yeah." She could picture it, a 15-year-old boy, walking the same path, alone, leaving everything behind. She wanted to ask more, how he had survived, what had finally made him leave. But something about the way he kept his eyes locked ahead, his face carved from stone, told her to wait. The trees finally thinned, and then, through the gaps in the branches, Emma saw it. The cabin. It was worse than she expected. The structure was old, the wood weathered and darkened by time. The roof sagged slightly, the windows were clouded with dirt, the porch steps were warped and uneven. Vines crept along the sides, reclaiming what had been abandoned. James stopped a few feet away, staring at it. Emma glanced at him. His breathing was slow, measured, but his fists were clenched. She reached for his hand, but he didn't take it. Instead, he exhaled sharply and stepped forward. "Let's get this over with," he muttered. The door creaked open under James's touch, and the smell of dust and stale air hit Emma immediately. Inside, the cabin was dark, the only light filtering through the grime-covered windows. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by their presence. Emma stepped in cautiously, her boots pressing into the warped wooden floor. The space was small, one main living area with a rusted-out wood stove, a couch covered in a moth-eaten blanket, and a rickety table with 2 chairs. James moved through the cabin like a ghost retracing its steps. He ran his fingers over the furniture, the walls, the carvings in the wood. He didn't speak. Emma's gaze landed on a stack of old newspapers on the table, yellowed with age. A few empty liquor bottles lay tipped over beside them. "How long were you here alone?" she asked softly. James didn't answer right away. He walked past the table, stopping in front of a small doorway. Emma followed him, peering inside. It was a bedroom, bare except for a thin mattress on the floor, a single wooden chair, and a set of deep scratches on the doorframe. "This was mine," James said quietly. Emma stepped inside, expecting to see something, a childhood relic, some sign of warmth. Instead, her eyes landed on something else, a bolt lock on the outside of the door. She felt her stomach drop. She turned to James, but he was already staring at it, his face blank, his shoulders rigid. "James," she breathed. "Why?" "They locked me in," he said. His voice was even, but the weight behind the words was devastating. "Whenever they got too drunk, whenever they didn't want to deal with me, sometimes for days." Emma pressed a hand to her mouth. She had known James had secrets. She had known he was hiding something painful, but she hadn't been prepared for this. James turned away from the door, walking back into the main room. His hands were shaking. Emma followed, her voice soft. "You never told me." James let out a bitter laugh. "Of course I didn't." He rubbed a hand over his face, breathing unsteadily. "They didn't want a kid. They wanted someone they could forget about." Emma's chest ached. "James," he shook his head. "I barely remember the good days, if there were any. Most of the time, it was just silence, them drinking, me locked in that room, listening to them fight, hoping they'd pass out before they remembered I was here." Emma's hands curled into fists. She had never met his parents, never even heard him mention them. Now she understood why. "One night," James continued, voice tight, "they forgot to lock the door. I packed a bag and left. I never looked back." Emma swallowed hard, blinking back the stinging in her eyes. James let out a shaky breath. "I spent my whole life trying to be better than them, trying to erase everything about this place from my mind. And then you told me we were having a baby." He looked at her, his expression raw, and suddenly it was back. The fear, the same thought over and over, what if I turn into them? What if I don't know how to be a father? Emma stepped forward. "James, you're not them. You don't know that." "Yes, I do," she said firmly, "because you care enough to be afraid." James stared at her. His breath shuddered, and then, finally, something inside him cracked. The cabin was silent except for the sound of James's breathing. Emma reached for his hand again. This time he took it. His grip was warm, solid, grounding, like he was finally letting her in. "You're already nothing like them, James," she whispered. "You left. You built a life for yourself. You love me, and you love our baby." James exhaled, a sound closer to a broken laugh than a sigh. He closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. For the first time since they had arrived, he looked lighter, like the weight he had been carrying all these years was finally lifting. Emma squeezed his hand. "Let's go home." James turned toward the door, taking one last look around. Then, together, they stepped out of the cabin, leaving the past behind. The road stretched ahead of them, endless and empty, lined by towering trees that seemed to blur together as the car moved forward. The cabin was behind them now, swallowed by the woods, but the weight of it lingered in the air between them. Emma sat in the passenger seat, watching James carefully. His grip on the steering wheel was firm, his shoulders rigid, his jaw tight, like he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. He hadn't spoken since they left. She wanted to say something, to reach for him, but she knew this silence wasn't about shutting her out. It was something else, processing, grieving, letting go. The rhythmic sound of the tires against the pavement filled the quiet. Outside, the sky had started to clear, the heavy gray clouds giving way to the soft glow of the setting sun. James exhaled, long and slow, like he was finally breathing again after holding it all in for too long. Then, without looking away from the road, he reached over and took Emma's hand. His grip was strong, grounding, but there was something else in it too, something raw and unspoken, a silent apology, a promise. Emma squeezed his hand in return, lacing her fingers through his, anchoring him to her. They didn't need words. For now, this was enough. Back home, the house felt both familiar and different. James dropped his duffel by the door and exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Emma watched him carefully, waiting to see if he would retreat into himself like before. But instead of disappearing into his office, he lingered in the living room, standing near the couch like he wasn't sure what to do next. "Do you want tea?" Emma offered. James blinked, then nodded. "Yeah, that'd be nice." It was such a small thing, but Emma felt something settle inside her. He was still here, still present. As she filled the kettle, she stole a glance at him. He had sunk onto the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. She walked over and sat beside him. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then finally, James broke the silence. "I don't want to be like them," he said quietly. Emma turned to him. His hands were clasped together, his fingers twisting absent-mindedly. "You're not," she said, just as softly. James let out a breath, shaking his head. "I want to believe that. I really do." Emma reached for his hand again, running her thumb over his knuckles. "Then let me help you believe it." James was quiet for a long time. Then finally he nodded. "I'm going to keep going to therapy," he said. His voice was steadier now, more certain. "But I don't want to do it alone anymore." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "What do you mean?" James swallowed. "I want you to come with me." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "Are you sure?" He nodded, looking at her for the first time since they sat down. "Yeah, I don't want to keep running from this." "From you." Emma squeezed his hand. "Okay," she whispered. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she saw it, the faintest hint of relief in James's eyes. A week later, Emma sat in a quiet office, her fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater. The room smelled like old books and fresh coffee, the walls lined with shelves filled with journals and therapy texts. A framed diploma sat on the desk, and beside it, a small plant that looked like it had been kept alive through sheer determination. Dr. Alan Pierce sat in a leather chair across from them, legs crossed, hands resting lightly on his notepad. He was in his late 50s, with graying hair and kind but observant eyes. James sat beside her, his posture tense but not closed off. "How does it feel to have Emma here with you today?" Dr. Pierce asked. James glanced at her, then back at the doctor. He hesitated, then said, "Strange." Emma didn't flinch. She knew this wasn't easy for him. "Strange how?" Dr. Pierce prompted. James exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. "I spent so long trying to keep all of this away from her. I thought if I ignored it, if I buried it deep enough, I could move past it." Dr. Pierce nodded. "And now?" James swallowed. "Now I just feel tired." Emma reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. Dr. Pierce studied him for a moment. "What changed?" James was quiet. Then finally he glanced at Emma again, something softer in his expression. "I don't want to keep running." Emma felt a deep warmth spread through her chest. It was the first time she truly believed he meant it. That night, Emma passed by James's office and noticed the light was still on. She knocked gently. "You okay?" James looked up from his desk, startled. He had a pencil in his hand, a notebook open in front of him. Emma stepped inside, curious. When she got closer, she saw what he was working on. Sketches, not buildings, not blueprints, a nursery. Emma's breath caught. James glanced at her, his expression uncertain. "I don't know if I'll be good at this," he admitted. Emma stepped forward, resting her hand over his. "You already are." James let out a shaky laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know about that." Emma squeezed his fingers. "I do." And for the first time she saw it, James letting himself believe it too. The months passed. The fear never fully disappeared, but James was learning to live with it instead of letting it control him. He still had doubts, still had moments where he pulled away. But now, he came back. He talked. He let Emma in. And then one evening, it happened. Emma gasped, gripping James's arm. "James!" His eyes widened. "Is it?" She nodded, breathless. "It's time." The hospital room was a blur of movement, but James never left her side. He held her hand through every contraction, every breath, every moment of pain and exhaustion. Then finally, there was a cry. Emma barely had time to process before the nurse gently placed the baby in James's arms. He stared down, his face unreadable, his hands slightly shaking. Emma watched him, waiting, heart pounding. Then slowly James exhaled. "You're safe," he whispered. And maybe finally so was. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the monitors and the soft, rhythmic breathing of their newborn. Emma lay in the hospital bed, exhausted but happy, watching as James cradled their son in his arms. James hadn't spoken in a while. He just sat there, staring down at the tiny life he held, as if afraid that moving too suddenly would break the fragile spell of the moment. "You okay?" Emma asked gently. James blinked, looking up at her. There was something different in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. "Peace." "Yeah," he murmured. "I think I am." Emma smiled. For so long, James had been haunted by his past, weighed down by the fear of becoming something he wasn't. But now, as he held their son, she could see it. He was finally free. The drive back home felt surreal. The world outside the car looked the same, Gray skies, wet pavement, the occasional flash of traffic lights, but everything had changed. Emma sat in the back seat beside the baby, her gaze drifting between James and their son. James's hands were steady on the wheel, his posture relaxed. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt like she could breathe again. When they pulled into the driveway, James hesitated before turning off the car. "James?" Emma asked. He exhaled and shook his head, smiling a little. I never really thought I'd be here." Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it. "You are, and you're exactly where you're supposed to be." James nodded. Then, with quiet determination, he got out and walked around the car, opening the door for her. Together, they stepped into their home, not just as a couple, but as a family. That night, after Emma and the baby had fallen asleep, James found himself standing in front of the nursery. The walls were soft blue, the furniture carefully chosen, everything arranged with love and care. It was nothing like the room he had grown up in. James stepped inside, moving quietly toward the crib. Their son lay swaddled in blankets, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. James leaned against the edge of the crib, his throat tightening. For so long he had been afraid of this, afraid of fatherhood, of repeating the past, of becoming something he had spent his entire life running from. But looking down at his son now, he realized something. He had already made his choice. He had left. He had fought. He had built something better, and that meant, no matter what fear whispered in the back of his mind, he was nothing like them. James reached down, running a gentle finger over his son's tiny hand. "I promise," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I will never be them." The baby stirred slightly, his tiny fingers curling around James's hand in his sleep. And just like that, James knew he would be okay. Over the next few weeks, life settled into something new. Sleepless nights, early mornings, the quiet chaos of learning how to be parents. James wasn't perfect, no one was, but he was present. He held the baby in the middle of the night when Emma needed to rest. He read parenting books, took turns with diaper changes, and whispered soft reassurances when their son cried. Most importantly, he talked to Emma, to Dr. Pierce, and to himself. One afternoon, Emma found him sitting in the nursery with their son curled against his chest. He was talking quietly, his voice low and steady. "When I was little, I was scared all the time. I don't want you to ever feel like that." Emma lingered in the doorway, watching. James pressed a kiss to the baby's forehead. "You're going to be loved, every single day. I swear." Emma felt her heart swell. James had once believed he was doomed to repeat the past, but now she saw the truth. He had already broken the cycle, and their son would never know the fear James had grown up with. Months passed. James still had his moments. There were still doubts, still fears that crept in when he least expected them, but he didn't let them control him anymore. One evening, as the sun set outside their window, Emma sat beside James on the couch, their son asleep in his arms. James glanced at her. "I never thanked you." Emma raised an eyebrow. "For what?" James looked down at their son, then back at her. "For not giving up on me." Emma smiled softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You were always worth fighting for, James." James exhaled, his arms tightening slightly around their baby. For the first time in his life, he believed her. And for the first time, he was truly home.